How a crew sailed into the ice and never came back out. They didn't sink, they froze in time. On the morning of May 19, 1845, two ships left the Thames estuary under a sky the color of iron. Their names were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and they carried 129 men into the Arctic Ocean with orders that were simple, direct, and impossible. Find the Northwest Passage, map the unknown, and return as heroes. The ships were the finest the Royal Navy could offer, reinforced hulls designed to withstand the crush of ice, steam engines to power through frozen seas, and provisions enough to last 3 years. The crew was handpicked, experienced, disciplined. Their commander, Sir John Franklin, was a veteran of polar exploration, a man who had survived starvation and cold before, a man the Admiralty trusted without question. They sailed north with confidence, with flags flying and brass buttons polished, with the weight of empire pressing at their backs. And then, somewhere between Greenland and the unknown white, they vanished. Not quickly, not cleanly, but slowly, in a way that defied every expectation, every preparation, every rule of survival the Navy had written into doctrine. They didn't sink in a storm, they didn't turn back in defeat, they didn't send distress signals that could be answered. They simply sailed into the ice and stopped existing, as if the Arctic had swallowed them whole and sealed the entrance behind them. For more than a decade, search parties scoured the frozen wasteland looking for answers. What they found instead were fragments, pieces of a story so disturbing that the British government tried to bury it, to rewrite it, to blame the victims rather than admit what had actually happened. They found bodies preserved in permafrost, faces locked in expressions that suggested something worse than cold, worse than hunger. They found abandoned campsites with equipment scattered in patterns that made no sense, supplies left behind that should have kept men alive, tools discarded as if they had forgotten what tools were for. They found messages carved into stone and scrawled on paper, messages that grew stranger and less coherent as time passed, as if language itself had begun to dissolve in the cold. And they found evidence of something that the Royal Navy refused to acknowledge, something that shattered the myth of British invincibility and revealed a truth about human nature that no one wanted to face. The men of the Franklin expedition didn't just die from exposure or starvation or scurvy, though all of those things played their part. They died because the environment broke them, not physically but psychologically, in ways that turned trained officers into something unrecognizable, that transformed a disciplined crew into a collection of individuals who could no longer cooperate, no longer think clearly, no longer remember who they had been before the ice closed in. This is not a story about exploration. This is a story about what happens when the human mind is placed in an environment so hostile, so alien, so utterly indifferent to survival that all the training, all the discipline, all the cultural conditioning that holds a society together simply collapses. This is a story about psychological warfare conducted not by an enemy nation but by nature itself, a campaign of terror so effective that it left no survivors and no clear record, only traces of madness frozen in time. The Arctic didn't just kill the Franklin expedition. It erased them, slowly, methodically, turning men into ghosts long before their bodies stopped moving. And what we know now, what the evidence has slowly revealed over more than a century and a half of investigation, is that the greatest threat they faced was not the cold or the ice or the polar bears. It was the gradual disintegration of their own minds, the loss of reason and identity and humanity that happens when the environment becomes so overwhelming that the brain can no longer process it, can no longer maintain the fiction that we are in control. This is War Archives Black, and this is the archive of the frozen men, the crew who sailed north with certainty and died in confusion, whose final weeks remain one of the most disturbing examples of psychological collapse ever documented. Between cold and memory, the ocean remembers everything. And what it remembers is this: there are places on Earth where the human mind was never meant to go, and when we force it there anyway, when we push past every warning and every limit, we discover that we are far more fragile than we ever believed. The Northwest Passage was more than a geographical objective. It was a symbol, a test of national will, a demonstration that British power could extend even into the most remote and hostile regions of the planet. For centuries, explorers had sought a navigable route through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, a shortcut that would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and give Britain unchallenged dominance over global trade. Dozens of expeditions had tried and failed, turned back by impenetrable ice, crushing pressure, and conditions that destroyed ships and men with equal efficiency. But by the 1840s, technology had advanced, maps had improved, and the Admiralty was convinced that success was finally possible. Sir John Franklin was 59 years old when he took command of the expedition, older than most polar explorers, a man with a reputation built on survival rather than success. He had been to the Arctic before, had led an overland expedition in the 1820s that ended in disaster, with men eating leather boots and lichen to stay alive, with rumors of cannibalism that were never quite confirmed or denied. He was not the first choice for this mission, not even the second, but he wanted it desperately, saw it as his last chance for glory, his final opportunity to secure a legacy that would outlast him. The Admiralty gave him the command because he was persistent, because he was available, and because they believed that with the right ships and the right provisions, even an aging officer could succeed where younger men had failed. The preparations were meticulous, almost obsessive. Erebus and Terror had been used in Antarctic expeditions before, had proven themselves capable of withstanding extreme conditions. For the Arctic mission, they were reinforced further, their bows sheathed in iron, their hulls doubled, their interiors fitted with steam heating systems that were supposed to keep the crew comfortable even in the coldest weather. They carried canned food, a new technology that promised to preserve meat and vegetables for years, eliminating the threat of scurvy that had plagued earlier expeditions. They carried libraries, musical instruments, writing supplies, everything necessary to maintain morale and civilization during long winters trapped in the ice. They carried enough coal to power the steam engines for weeks, enough rum to keep the men's spirits high, enough ammunition to hunt for fresh meat if the canned supplies ran low. On paper it was perfect. Every contingency had been considered, every risk assessed and mitigated. The Royal Navy had taken everything they had learned from decades of polar exploration and applied it to this mission, creating what they believed was an unstoppable force, a crew that could endure anything the Arctic could throw at them. The men were volunteers, experienced sailors who understood the risks and accepted them, who trusted their officers and their equipment and their nation's ability to bring them home safely. When the ships departed in May 1845, there was celebration, confidence, certainty. The only question was not whether they would succeed, but how quickly, how completely, how definitively they would prove that British determination could conquer even the most hostile environment on Earth. The last confirmed sighting of the expedition came in late July 1845, when a whaling ship encountered Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay, waiting for the ice to clear before proceeding westward. The crew was in good health, the ships were intact, and Franklin was optimistic. He sent letters home that were carried back by the whalers, letters that spoke of favorable conditions and high morale, letters that assured his wife and the Admiralty that everything was proceeding according to plan. And then the ships sailed into Lancaster Sound, into the labyrinth of islands and channels and ice that made up the Canadian Arctic, and they were never seen again by anyone who could report back to civilization. What happened next can only be reconstructed from fragments, from the physical evidence left behind and the few written records that survived. But what that evidence reveals is a story of slow deterioration, of plans that failed in ways no one had anticipated, of a crew that remained disciplined and hopeful far longer than they should have, clinging to the belief that rescue would come, that the ice would release them, that British ingenuity and determination would somehow overcome physics and biology, and the simple fact that they were in a place where humans cannot survive without constant resupply. By September 1845, the ships had reached the northern coast of King William Island, where they became trapped in pack ice. This was not unusual. Arctic expeditions routinely spent winters frozen in place, waiting for spring thaw to free them. The crew settled in for what they expected to be a few months of confinement, maintaining routines, keeping the ships heated, rationing supplies according to the careful calculations made in London. They performed plays, held classes, maintained naval discipline with the same precision they would have shown in Portsmouth Harbor. They believed they were safe, that the ships would protect them, that time was on their side. But the ice didn't melt in the spring of 1846. The summer came and went, and the ships remained locked in place, surrounded by pressure ridges and frozen sea that stretched to every horizon. This was concerning but not yet catastrophic. The expedition had supplies for 3 years, and Franklin made the decision to wait another season, to conserve resources and trust that the next summer would bring release. The crew continued their routines, though the mood shifted, became quieter, more anxious. The Arctic summer is brief, a few weeks when temperatures rise above freezing and the ice becomes navigable, and watching that window close without movement would have been psychologically devastating in ways that are difficult to describe. Imagine being trapped in a steel box, surrounded by an environment that wants to kill you, knowing that escape is only possible for a few weeks each year, and watching those weeks pass while the ice refuses to cooperate. Imagine the slow realization that the careful plans made by experts in London were based on assumptions about ice patterns that turned out to be wrong, that your survival depends on factors completely outside your control, that every day that passes is a day closer to running out of food, fuel, hope. The psychological pressure of this situation cannot be overstated. These were men trained to act, to solve problems, to impose order on chaos, and they were being forced into absolute passivity, waiting for nature to grant them permission to move. By the fall of 1846, the first signs of serious trouble would have appeared. The canned food, which was supposed to be their salvation, was poisoning them. The canning process was new and poorly understood, and the company contracted to supply the expedition had used lead solder to seal the tins, contaminating the contents with a neurotoxin that accumulates in the body over time. Lead poisoning is insidious. It doesn't kill quickly, but it damages the brain, impairs judgment, causes paranoia and confusion, and eventually complete cognitive breakdown. The crew wouldn't have known what was happening to them, wouldn't have understood why they were becoming irritable, forgetful, irrational. They would have attributed it to the stress of confinement, to the darkness of the Arctic winter, to natural responses to an unnatural situation. At the same time, scurvy was beginning to take hold. Despite the canned vegetables, despite the careful planning, vitamin C degrades over time, and by the second year the crew's diet was insufficient to prevent the disease. Scurvy doesn't just cause physical symptoms. It causes psychological ones as well, depression and lethargy and a sense of hopelessness that makes it difficult to care about survival. Combined with lead poisoning, with the stress of prolonged confinement, with the growing realization that rescue was not coming and the ice was not releasing them, the crew of the Franklin expedition was being subjected to a perfect storm of environmental and chemical stressors that were systematically destroying their ability to think rationally. Franklin himself died in June 1847, though the cause is unknown. The only record is a brief note left in a cairn on King William Island, written a year later by the surviving officers, stating that he died on the 11th of June and that the ships had been trapped for 19 months. The note is formal, restrained, revealing nothing about the circumstances of his death or the state of the expedition. But the fact that the commander died less than 2 years into a mission planned to last at least 3 suggests that something had gone seriously wrong, that the conditions aboard the ships were far worse than anyone in London had anticipated. Command passed to Francis Crozier, captain of HMS Terror, a more experienced Arctic explorer than Franklin but a man now faced with an impossible situation. By April 1848, when the decision was finally made to abandon the ships and attempt to walk south toward the Canadian mainland, the expedition had been trapped for 2.5 years. 105 men remained alive out of the original 129, meaning that nearly a quarter of the crew had already died, almost certainly from a combination of disease, poisoning, cold, and despair. The decision to abandon ship is documented in a second note left at the same cairn. This one hurried, the handwriting less steady, the tone revealing strain. The note states that the ships had been deserted on April 22, that the survivors were heading south toward the Back River, that Crozier was in command. What the note doesn't say, what it cannot say, is that this was an act of desperation by men who had lost the ability to think clearly, who were making decisions based on deteriorating mental faculties and incomplete information, who were choosing a course of action that had almost no chance of success. The distance from where the ships were abandoned to the nearest Hudson's Bay Company outpost was more than 1,000 miles, across some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. The men were already weakened by years of confinement, poisoned by lead, suffering from scurvy, psychologically damaged by prolonged isolation and darkness. They were pulling heavy sledges loaded with supplies, traveling in spring when the ice was unstable and the cold was still lethal. They had no clear route, no reliable maps, no guarantee that the rivers and lakes they were aiming for would be navigable or even findable. And yet they left the ships, left the shelter and remaining supplies, and began walking south into an environment that was even more hostile than the one they were abandoning. This decision is one of the most debated aspects of the Franklin mystery. Why leave the ships at all? Why not stay with the shelter and heat and remaining provisions until rescue arrived? The answer, as it has slowly emerged from the archaeological evidence, is that the men were no longer capable of rational decision-making. The lead poisoning had progressed to the point where cognitive function was severely impaired. The officers were making choices that made no sense, prioritizing strange items over useful ones, abandoning critical supplies while carrying useless luxuries. The crew, weakened and confused, followed orders because that's what they had been trained to do, because military discipline was the last structure holding them together, even as that discipline was leading them towards certain death. The physical evidence of what happened during the march south is fragmentary but deeply disturbing. Search parties in the 1850s found campsites scattered across King William Island, each one revealing more about the expedition's deteriorating condition. At some sites they found boats that had been dragged miles inland, filled with items that served no survival purpose. Silk handkerchiefs, silver cutlery, books, clothing far too heavy for travel. These were not the choices of men thinking clearly about survival. These were the choices of men clinging to symbols of civilization, unable to let go of the identities they had carried from England even as those identities became fatal burdens. At other sites they found bodies, frozen and preserved by the permafrost, remains that showed signs of malnutrition so severe that the final weeks must have been a slow descent into starvation. But more disturbing than the starvation was the evidence of what the survivors had done to try to stay alive. Cut marks on bones, human bones, marks consistent with defleshing and marrow extraction, signs that cannibalism had occurred, not as a sudden act of desperation but as a sustained survival strategy over weeks or months. The British public and the Admiralty refused to believe this evidence at first. Cannibalism was unthinkable, impossible for British naval officers and men, a crime that could not be admitted even in the face of death. But the Inuit people who lived in the region told stories to the search parties, stories of encountering white men who were walking south, dragging boats, looking like walking corpses, men who were hostile and strange and clearly dying. The Inuit offered help, offered food and guidance, but the men refused, either unable to understand the offers or too proud to accept assistance from people they had been trained to view as inferior. This refusal is another piece of the psychological collapse. The expedition members were so invested in their identity as representatives of British power and civilization that they could not accept help from indigenous people, could not adapt to local survival strategies, could not abandon the cultural programming that told them they were superior even as that programming killed them. The Inuit survived in the Arctic by being flexible, by adapting to conditions, by using every resource available. The British sailors died because they clung to rigid hierarchies, to formal routines, to beliefs about what was proper and what was shameful, beliefs that had no survival value in an environment that did not care about social status or national pride. The march south was not a march at all but a slow disintegration, a procession of dying men who were no longer thinking strategically, no longer capable of cooperation, no longer able to recognize that their mission had failed and their only goal should be immediate survival. They scattered across the island in small groups, each group making different decisions, following different routes, dying in different ways. Some turned back toward the ships, perhaps realizing too late that abandoning shelter had been a mistake. Some continued south until they simply collapsed and stopped moving. Some tried to hunt, to fish, to find food in an environment where food was scarce and required skills they didn't possess. The last confirmed traces of the expedition date to the late summer of 1848, 4 months after the ships were abandoned. After that, there is only silence, only the slow accumulation of remains that would be found years and decades later, each discovery adding another fragment to the story but never completing it, never providing a clear narrative of what the final days or hours were like for the men who lasted longest. Modern forensic analysis of recovered remains has confirmed the lead poisoning, confirmed the scurvy, confirmed the cannibalism. It has also revealed evidence of tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other diseases that would have spread rapidly among weakened men living in close quarters. The bodies show signs of extreme stress, of malnutrition so severe that organs began to shut down, of exposure so prolonged that frostbite damaged extremities beyond recovery. But none of this fully explains the psychological component, the way the men's behavior became increasingly irrational, the way trained officers made decisions that violated every principle of survival they had been taught. What the Franklin expedition reveals is not just the physical limits of human endurance but the psychological ones. There is a point where the brain, subjected to enough stress, enough chemical damage, enough sensory deprivation and environmental hostility, simply stops functioning normally. The men of Erebus and Terror reached that point gradually, over months and years, their cognitive abilities declining so slowly that they probably didn't realize it was happening, didn't recognize that they were losing the capacity to save themselves. This is the horror at the center of the story. Not that they died, because death in the Arctic was always a possibility, always a risk that came with polar exploration. The horror is that they died while still capable of movement, still following orders, still maintaining some semblance of discipline and structure, but no longer able to make the choices that might have saved them. They became zombies, in a sense, biological machines that continued to function even as the minds directing those machines deteriorated into confusion and despair. The search for the Franklin expedition became one of the largest rescue operations in history, with more than 30 expeditions sent into the Arctic over the course of a decade, searching for survivors or evidence of what had happened. The British government spent enormous sums, driven partly by genuine concern for the missing men but also by the need to control the narrative, to prevent the truth from undermining public confidence in British exploration and military competence. What the search parties found forced them to confront realities that contradicted everything the Admiralty wanted to believe. They found evidence that the expedition had been doomed almost from the start, that the ice conditions in 1845 to 1846 were unusually severe, that the route Franklin chose was the worst possible option, trapping the ships in a location where the ice almost never fully melts. They found evidence that the preparations had been inadequate, that the canned food was poisoned, that the ship's heating systems were insufficient, that the crew had been sent into the Arctic with technology and supplies that looked impressive but failed under real-world conditions. Most disturbingly, they found evidence that the men had survived far longer than anyone expected, had continued struggling for years after they should have accepted defeat, had maintained hope and discipline and belief in rescue long past the point where hope was rational. This was not a quick disaster, it was a slow one, giving the men time to think, to fear, to understand exactly how badly things had gone wrong, to watch their own minds and bodies deteriorate with full awareness of what was happening. The psychological torture of this cannot be overstated. These were not men who died in sudden accidents or violent encounters. They died knowing they were dying, watching it happen day by day, unable to stop it despite their training and their technology and their national pride. They died in an environment that was utterly indifferent to their suffering, where the cold was so constant that it became background reality, where the darkness of the Arctic winter lasted for months without relief, where every choice led to the same outcome because the fundamental problem, being trapped in a place where humans cannot survive without external support, was unsolvable. The British government's response to the findings was to minimize, to reframe, to construct a narrative that preserved the heroism of the expedition while quietly suppressing the most disturbing details. Official reports focused on bad luck and difficult conditions, avoiding any suggestion that the planning had been flawed or that British naval doctrine was inadequate for polar exploration. The stories of cannibalism were dismissed or attributed to the expedition's final days, presented as a last resort rather than a sustained practice. The evidence of lead poisoning was not understood at the time and so went unreported. The full psychological breakdown of the crew was never officially acknowledged because doing so would have required admitting that the human mind has limits, that training and discipline and cultural conditioning can all fail when the environment becomes hostile enough. But the people who studied the evidence, who read the few surviving documents and examined the remains and listened to the Inuit testimony, understood something that the government did not want acknowledged. The Franklin expedition failed not because the men were weak or cowardly or unprepared, but because the task itself was impossible with the technology and understanding available at the time. They failed because the Arctic is fundamentally hostile to human life, because our species did not evolve to survive in environments where the temperature is always below freezing, where there is no natural food source, where darkness can last for half the year. What happened to Franklin and his crew was not an adventure that went wrong. It was an execution, slow and methodical, carried out by an environment that was always going to kill them, that gave them false hope by letting them survive the first year, the second year, that allowed them to believe rescue was possible or escape was achievable right up until the moment when their bodies and minds could no longer continue. The Arctic broke them not through violence but through attrition, through the steady application of cold and darkness and isolation until every psychological defense collapsed and every physical system failed. The wrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were finally located in 2014 and 2016 respectively, using modern sonar and underwater robotics, found in waters off the coast of King William Island exactly where the historical evidence suggested they would be. The ships are remarkably well preserved, the cold water having prevented decay, and diving expeditions have recovered artifacts that provide new insights into the crew's final days aboard the vessels. What these artifacts reveal is a crew that maintained order almost until the end, that kept the ships organized and functional even as they slowly died inside them. The interiors show no signs of panic or violence, no evidence that the men turned on each other or abandoned discipline. The arrangement of supplies suggests rationing was carefully managed, that officers continued to control distribution even as those supplies dwindled toward nothing. This is both reassuring and deeply unsettling, because it means the psychological collapse happened slowly enough that the external structures of naval hierarchy remained intact even as the internal mental states of the men deteriorated beyond recovery. One of the most haunting artifacts recovered from Erebus was a journal fragment, badly damaged by water but partially legible, containing entries from the second winter trapped in the ice. The handwriting deteriorates across the pages, starting neat and controlled and gradually becoming less steady, the words harder to read, the thoughts less coherent. The writer describes routine tasks, checking ice thickness, maintaining the heating system, organizing inventory, but the tone shifts from confident to anxious to something that reads almost like dissociation, as if the writer is describing events happening to someone else, as if he has mentally removed himself from his own experience. The entries stop abruptly in March 1847, 3 months before Franklin's death, and the final words are not a dramatic declaration or a cry for help but a simple notation about temperature and wind direction, technical data recorded with mechanical precision by someone who is still following procedures even though those procedures no longer serve any purpose. This might be the most disturbing artifact of all, evidence that the crew continued to act like sailors, like officers, like representatives of the Royal Navy, continued to collect data and maintain logs and follow regulations even as their mission had become meaningless and their survival impossible. This is what institutional conditioning does. It creates behavioral patterns so deeply ingrained that they continue even when circumstances have changed beyond recognition, even when the original purpose has been lost. The crew of the Franklin expedition remained sailors until the moment they died, not because being sailors helped them survive but because they had been trained so thoroughly that they could not conceive of being anything else. Their identity was their prison, the rigid structures that were supposed to keep them safe becoming the structures that prevented them from adapting to reality. Modern psychological research on isolation and extreme environments has used the Franklin expedition as a case study, analyzing what happens to human cognition when subjected to prolonged stress in hostile conditions. The findings confirm what the historical evidence suggested. There are limits to human mental endurance, thresholds beyond which rational decision-making becomes impossible no matter how well-trained or disciplined the individuals are. The combination of factors the expedition faced, lead poisoning damaging neural tissue, vitamin deficiency affecting brain chemistry, constant cold forcing the body to divert resources away from cognitive function, darkness disrupting circadian rhythms, social isolation eliminating external reality checks, and the stress of knowing death is approaching slowly, creates a perfect environment for psychological breakdown. Each factor alone is manageable, but together they form a cascade where each problem amplifies the others, where physical damage impairs judgment which leads to worse physical conditions which further impairs judgment in an accelerating spiral toward complete collapse. What makes the Franklin story particularly instructive is the timeline. These men didn't break immediately, they maintained coherence for more than 2 years before reaching the point where they made the fatal decision to abandon the ships. This demonstrates that human psychology is remarkably resilient, capable of enduring extraordinary stress for extended periods, but also that resilience has a limit, and when that limit is reached the collapse can be rapid and total. The officers who decided to march south in April 1848 were not cowards or fools. They were men whose brains had been damaged by lead, whose bodies were failing from scurvy, whose circadian rhythms had been disrupted by Arctic winters, whose stress levels had been elevated beyond normal ranges for years, whose social support systems had been reduced to a shrinking group of equally damaged men. In that state, the decision to abandon shelter and walk into the wilderness probably seemed reasonable, logical even, a decisive action after years of passive waiting. This is the true horror of the Franklin expedition. Not that the men died, but that they died while believing they were making rational choices, while following plans that seemed sound to minds that were no longer capable of sound judgment. They walked south with purpose and determination, dragging boats and supplies, maintaining formation and hierarchy, and they had no idea that they were already dead, that their brains had been so damaged and their thinking so impaired that they were executing a suicide mission while believing it was a rescue attempt. The legacy of the Franklin expedition is not what the British Admiralty wanted it to be. It did not become a story of heroic endurance and noble sacrifice. It became instead a cautionary tale about the limits of human capability, about what happens when technological confidence exceeds actual understanding, about the ways that institutional conditioning can prevent adaptation and learning. In the decades following the disaster, Arctic exploration changed. Later expeditions learned from Franklin's mistakes, adopted Inuit survival techniques, traveled lighter and more flexibly, accepted that cooperation with indigenous peoples was necessary rather than shameful. The Royal Navy stopped treating polar exploration as a military operation and started treating it as a scientific one, requiring different skills and different attitudes. The Northwest Passage was eventually navigated successfully, but not by British naval officers and reinforced ships. It was accomplished by smaller crews and smaller vessels who were willing to learn from the environment rather than trying to dominate it. But the psychological lessons of the Franklin expedition have never been fully absorbed, because they are too disturbing, too threatening to human self-image. We want to believe that training and discipline and willpower can overcome any challenge, that the human mind is infinitely resilient if properly prepared. The Franklin story proves this is false. It proves that there are environments so hostile that no amount of preparation is sufficient, that the brain itself becomes a liability when subjected to enough stress, that our very identity and conditioning can prevent us from seeing reality clearly enough to save ourselves. This is why the Franklin expedition remains relevant more than a century and a half after it disappeared into the ice. It is not just a historical footnote or an interesting mystery, it is a demonstration of fundamental truths about human psychology that we still resist acknowledging. We are not as rational as we believe. We are not as resilient as we claim. We are biological organisms with evolved limitations, and when we push past those limitations, when we enter environments our brains did not evolve to handle, we discover that our greatest strengths, our ability to maintain discipline, to follow plans, to believe in success, can become weaknesses that lead us toward disaster while we remain convinced we are moving toward salvation. The men of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror did not fail because they were weak. They failed because they were strong in exactly the wrong ways, disciplined when flexibility was needed, structured when adaptation was necessary, confident when doubt would have saved them. They carried British civilization into the Arctic and discovered that civilization is not a universal truth but a fragile construct that requires specific environmental conditions to maintain, and when those conditions are absent the whole structure collapses inward, leaving only the biological animal underneath, and that animal was never equipped to survive where they tried to take it. The ice preserved their bodies but it did not preserve their story. What we know of their final months comes from fragments and forensics, from cut marks on bones and lead levels in tissue, from the locations where they fell and the items they carried and the routes they attempted. We know the physical facts but we can only imagine the psychological reality, the slow realization that rescue was not coming, that the ships would not be freed, that every day was bringing them closer to death and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Imagine being trapped in darkness for months at a time, the temperature never rising above freezing, your food slowly poisoning you while you eat it, your body weakening day by day, your mind becoming less sharp, less clear, less capable of processing what is happening. Imagine maintaining routine and discipline because that is all you have left, because the alternative is to admit that everything you believed about yourself and your nation and your mission was wrong. Imagine watching your companions die one by one, burying them in ice because the ground is too frozen to dig graves, and knowing that soon you will join them and there will be no one left to bury you. Imagine making the decision to leave the ships to walk south, believing it is your last chance at survival when in fact it is the moment you guarantee your death. Imagine dragging boats across the ice, pulling sleds loaded with supplies you will never use, following officers whose judgment has deteriorated to the point where they can no longer distinguish useful items from useless ones, necessary actions from fatal ones. Imagine continuing to follow orders because discipline is the only thing holding you together because without hierarchy and structure you are just an animal dying in the cold, and at least as a sailor you have identity, purpose, meaning, even if that meaning is leading you step by step toward oblivion. This is what the Franklin expedition experienced. Not a dramatic battle or a sudden catastrophe but a slow fade, a gradual dimming of consciousness and capability and hope until there was nothing left but the mechanical continuation of behaviors that no longer served any purpose. They became ghosts before they died, hollow men going through motions they had been trained to perform, and when they finally stopped moving the ice preserved them exactly as they fell, monuments to human fragility disguised as human determination. The true legacy of the Franklin expedition is not geographical or scientific but psychological. It is a demonstration of the limits of human cognition under stress, a case study in how institutional conditioning can prevent adaptation, a warning about the dangers of isolation and environmental extremes. It is proof that there are situations where doing everything right according to your training and culture still leads to disaster, where the rules that normally keep you safe become the rules that kill you, where identity itself becomes a prison. This lesson has never been fully learned because it contradicts too many beliefs that societies need to maintain about themselves. Nations want to believe that their citizens are capable of extraordinary feats, that proper training can overcome any challenge, that cultural values and institutional discipline are always strengths rather than sometimes being weaknesses. Individuals want to believe that willpower and determination matter, that effort correlates with outcomes, that we have control over our destinies rather than being at the mercy of biology and environment. The Franklin expedition challenges all these beliefs. It shows British sailors, among the best trained and most disciplined in the world, reduced to confusion and madness by an environment their brains could not handle. It shows careful planning and expensive equipment failing to prevent disaster. It shows that following orders and maintaining hierarchy, usually sources of strength, becoming sources of weakness when the orders are based on impaired judgment and the hierarchy prevents questioning of flawed decisions. Most uncomfortably, it shows that the men themselves probably never realized how badly things had gone wrong, that they died believing they had done their duty and followed proper procedures, that they maintained their self-image as competent British sailors even as their actions became increasingly irrational. This suggests that we cannot always trust our own judgment about our mental state, that cognitive decline can be invisible to the person experiencing it, that we might be making terrible decisions while believing we are being perfectly rational. This possibility is terrifying because it removes our last line of defense against failure, the belief that we would recognize if we were thinking poorly and could correct ourselves. If the Franklin officers could not recognize their own impairment, could not see that their judgment had been compromised, could not understand that abandoning the ships was suicidal rather than strategic, then how can any of us be confident that we are thinking clearly, that our decisions make sense, that we are not walking toward disaster while believing we are walking toward salvation? The answer, uncomfortable as it is that we cannot be certain. We rely on external checks, on other people to tell us when our thinking seems off, on systems and institutions to catch errors before they become catastrophic. But those checks only work if the people providing them are not experiencing the same impairment, if there is someone present with clear judgment to identify compromised judgment in others. The Franklin crew had no such external check, were all suffering from the same poisoning and environmental stress, had only each other for validation, and so they walked together into death, convinced they were making good decisions because everyone around them agreed those decisions were good. This is what makes isolation so dangerous, not the physical separation but the psychological one, the loss of external perspectives that might reveal flaws in our thinking. Modern long-duration expeditions and missions maintain constant communication partly to prevent physical emergencies but also to prevent psychological ones, to ensure that people in extreme environments have access to voices and perspectives from outside those environments, voices that might notice changes in behavior or decision-making that the affected individuals cannot see in themselves. But even constant communication cannot entirely solve the problem because there are cognitive changes that happen slowly enough to seem normal, that adapt to gradually enough that neither the affected person nor distant observers recognize the decline until it has progressed significantly. The brain is remarkably good at rationalizing its own impairment, at constructing narratives that make deteriorating functions seem like appropriate responses to challenging circumstances. In the end, the Franklin expedition is not a story about ships or ice or geographical exploration. It is a story about minds, about what happens to human consciousness when subjected to prolonged stress in an environment fundamentally hostile to human life. It is about the fragility of rationality, the vulnerability of identity, the ease with which our most firmly held beliefs can become liabilities rather than assets. The crew sailed north as representatives of the most powerful empire on Earth, confident in their technology, their training, their cultural superiority. They died as confused animals who had forgotten what they were or why they were there, who followed paths that led nowhere, who clung to symbols and procedures that no longer had meaning. The transformation from one state to the other took years, happened gradually enough that they never consciously recognized it, left them believing until the end that they were still the same men who had departed England in 1845. But they were not the same men. The Arctic had changed them, had taken their confidence and replaced it with confusion, had taken their discipline and perverted it into rigidity that prevented adaptation, had taken their identity as British sailors and made that identity the thing that prevented them from learning how to survive. They became ghosts of themselves, hollow men performing rituals that no longer connected to any reality except the reality of their own impending death. This is what extreme environments do to human psychology when exposure is prolonged and support is absent. They strip away the layers of culture and training and identity until what remains is just the basic biological organism, and that organism was never meant to function in temperatures that never rise above freezing, in darkness that lasts for months, in isolation that has no end. The organism continues trying long past the point where trying serves any purpose, continues until the body itself fails and movement becomes impossible and consciousness fades into the final darkness that is no different from the Arctic darkness except that it lasts forever. The bodies in the ice are testament to this process, frozen in whatever positions they held when they stopped moving, preserved in the act of dying so that more than a century later they can still be examined, their bones still showing the cut marks that indicate cannibalism, their tissues still containing the lead that poisoned them, their faces still wearing expressions that suggest the end was not peaceful, not accepted, not anything except the final cessation of a struggle that had gone on far too long. They haunt us, these frozen men, because they show us what we could become under the wrong circumstances, what we might already be becoming without recognizing it, what awaits any of us who push beyond the limits of human psychological endurance. They haunt us because they were not weak or cowardly or unprepared. They were strong and brave and as prepared as anyone could be with the knowledge available in 1845. And they died anyway, died badly, died in ways that stripped away dignity and humanity and left only suffering. The ocean remembers. The ice remembers. And what it remembers is not the glory of exploration or the nobility of sacrifice but the simple fact that human beings have limits, that there are places we cannot go and survive, that our minds are as fragile as our bodies and sometimes more so, that pride and determination and cultural identity cannot overcome physics and biology and the indifference of an environment that was never meant to support human life. 129 men sailed into the Arctic seeking glory and found only darkness. They sought passage and found prison. They sought triumph and found defeat so complete that even their names were nearly forgotten, their fate unknown for decades, their suffering unrecorded except in the marks left on bones and the items scattered across frozen islands, fragments of a disaster that tells us everything about human fragility and nothing about human triumph. This is the archive of the frozen men, the crew who never came back, who remain even now in the ice and water of the Canadian Arctic, their ships entombed on the ocean floor, their bodies scattered across islands where no humans live, where nothing lives except in brief summers, where the cold dominates and the darkness rules and the ice waits patient and eternal for the next group of humans who believe they can challenge it and win. They cannot win. We cannot win. The Franklin expedition proved it in blood and bone and the slow dissolution of human reason under stress that human reason was never evolved to handle. We know this now, know it completely, know it in ways the Admiralty of 1845 did not, could not, would not acknowledge even if they had known. And yet we continue to push into extreme environments, continue to test the same limits that destroyed Franklin and his crew. We go with better equipment and better preparation and better understanding, but we go nonetheless, driven by the same impulses that drove them, the need to explore, to discover, to prove that human will can overcome natural limits. And sometimes we succeed, reach our goals and return safely, proving that preparation and technology matter, that we have learned from past disasters. But sometimes we do not succeed. Sometimes the environment wins despite preparation, despite technology, despite everything we have learned. And when that happens, when another crew disappears or another expedition ends in disaster, we examine what went wrong and we update protocols and we promise to do better next time. But we do not stop going, do not accept that there are places humans should not try to reach, do not internalize the lesson that the Franklin expedition taught so clearly. There are limits to human endurance, psychological limits as real as physical ones, and when we exceed those limits we do not become heroes, we become casualties, adding our names to the list of those who learned too late that determination is not enough, that will is not enough, that being human is not enough when the environment itself is fundamentally hostile to everything that makes us human. If you've listened this far, you already know too much. You've heard the story that the British Admiralty tried to bury, the truth about what happens when human minds are pushed past their breaking point, the reality that no amount of training or discipline can prevent psychological collapse under sufficient stress. You've learned that the frozen men of the Franklin expedition did not die as heroes but as victims, not of their own weakness but of institutional arrogance, cultural conditioning, and an environment that was always going to kill them no matter what they did. Subscribe to War Archives Black. Join us as we explore the archives that were never meant to be opened, the stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and the mechanisms of control, fear, and psychological breakdown. Remember that silence is control, that forgetting is a choice, that the past holds lessons we ignore at our peril. The ice is still there waiting. The cold is still there patient. And somewhere in the frozen north, the remains of 129 men are still there too, testament to human ambition and human limitation, monuments to the fact that there are battles we cannot win because we were never meant to fight them. Like this video, if you've felt the echo of fear, if you've understood that we are more fragile than we pretend, if you've recognized that the greatest threats to human survival are not always external enemies but our own inability to acknowledge our limits. And join us again when the next archive opens, when the next truth emerges from darkness, when the next story reveals what we prefer to keep hidden. The ocean remembers everything. And now, so do you.